Welcome to the Maker Everything podcast. I'm Bryan DeLuca from Maker Build It.
And I'm Todd Saal from the Creative Mind Trip.
So today we're talking about what gets people into 3D printing. And I'm just going to start off with this. Todd, why did you start 3D printing?
Well, I've always been kind of intrigued by it as it's kind of come about. But honestly, I kind of procrastinated even getting into it because, the print, and this was even just a few years ago, the printers were expensive. Mm-hmm. And then when I was looking at the budget route, the amount of work that you needed to do to them to sort of make them even semi-functional, I just kind of didn't want to tinker on that end of things. I actually wanted to use them and not actually make better printers. But then COVID hit, and that was a couple of years after that. And, we all tried to learn new stuff, and I started getting into digital modeling around the time and started looking at 3D printers again. And the prices definitely started coming down. The budget printers definitely got a lot better, the hardware and the software. So I picked up my first printer right around COVID. I picked up a Creality Ender 3 S1, I think it is. But I paid like a little over $200 for it. Right. Couple of issues in the beginning, user error, screwing things up, and did replace a couple of parts, but that was my error on why I had to do that. And then once I learned a little bit more about how to really set things up, honestly, the thing's been pretty rock solid, since then. What was interesting was I was amazed at how many functional things that I printed, because when I got into it, I really thought, because I was doing a lot of clay sculpting at the time. So as I got into digital sculpting, I really thought I was just going to do sculpting, in that way. But I wound up doing more functional things, mainly because of COVID. I couldn't get certain things, so I modeled them myself and printed them and got around those issues in that way.
Right.
But then over time, as COVID kind of wore on and we all sort of got back to whatever normal is now, right? I then started getting even more and more into the digital modeling side and got better at that. And then, talking to you and watching other stuff and looking at what other people were doing, I started getting more intrigued into the resin side. But here, here in Nashville, we don't have a lot of basements, a lot of bedrock. It's very costly to create, houses with basements and things like that. So I had more of an issue of getting into that because of the health and safety issues, and where I was going to print, because basically I was printing with my FDM printer in just a spare bedroom.
Right.
And so what I wound up eventually doing is setting it up in my garage, in a grow tent, and just got into it in that way. So, and now it's just taken on a life of its own.
Yeah.
So I do get into it.
Right. Well, I started with resin printing. So I'm probably one of the opposite realm people here.
Sure.
Right? Most people started with FDM printing. I really started with resin printing. Now, my exposure was originally to filament printing. And the first time I actually, and I was always intrigued when look, 3D printers the technology has been around for a long time, right? It's nothing, It's nothing really new. But what's crazy about it is the first time I ever saw a 3D printer actually really functioning, besides online, in person, was actually when I was at NASA. And they were actually printing, I forgot what it was. It was the topology of Mars that had been mapped out, whatever it was, right? I was oh, this is really cool. Now, this printer, the table size was the size of a small bedroom, a 10 by 12, right? It was big, and same thing when printers first came out, there was a lot of tinkering that went on with them. And I first got into it from the resin aspect because, as most of who watch me, I love sort of fantasy stuff, and D&D minis is always on that bucket list and the detail that comes along with resin printing. And quickly I went from there to basically filament printing. Now, what was interesting is I sort of found the same thing, but I sort of started modifying what I was doing with FDM printing. Like I started printing very functional things, and I started modeling stuff. But the problem is, it was too detailed for an FDM printer. And now they're getting much better, but
Yeah.
it was still way too detailed. So I wind up printing some basic stuff, even some of the fantasy stuff and the sort of cosplay stuff I started printing on the FDMs. It's still not. I shouldn't say it's still not, because it's getting there, but it's still not the same quality you get out of a resin printer. But I'm sort of the anomaly, because most people, when you talk to them, they started on the filament side and basically have moved on to things like resin printing, where for me, I started with the resin printing and moved into FDM. But I could show you something I'm working on now, but you can even see like the quality, the detail quality of this is printed in this was PLA, I think. I don't
Yeah.
think it was PETG, but you can see the difference in the quality now of some of these filament printers. It's crazy, because my first one, speaking about first printers, was an Ender. Also, it was an Ender 3, I think, V2. So that was my first printer with the glass bed. You had a no auto leveling whatsoever. Nothing, not even the
Yeah,
sensor.
they did make some pretty good improvements
Yeah,
from the version V2 to V3.
yeah.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
yeah, and it's been, it's from there. I've probably printed everything under the sun, from really functional stuff, designed everything on the sun, from really functional stuff to sort of really creative stuff. And basically, so what really got me into it, to me, it's, for me, right? It was no different than, I was the kid that when you got a Lego set, and I remember my first one was this like castle with knights and stuff you were supposed to build, and you built it, then you tore it apart, you built whatever you want with those Legos, right? I was the
Right.
kid that was like, I'm just going to build sort of whatever I want with the Legos, right? So, I would build it to see how it functioned, and then I was like onto my own thing anyway. So, it's sort of like, just like they've come to a point where it's easy. And while I am pretty much a natural tinkerer, like I like messing with stuff,
Yeah.
it look, the first time I bed leveled that Ender, it probably took me 2 hours to get it correct, and
Yeah.
it had a glass plate, and I'm still using the same glass plate, but it definitely has some scratches in it at this point from even the initial day of self leveling it, or I should say leveling it the first time, because it didn't self level, which I wish it did, like these new ones. But yeah, so really what got me into 3D printing was just the fantasy aspect of being able to create some of these things without having to use all this other material, like being able to design it and then just drop it in and actually let it rip and build it out from there. So yeah.
Yeah, even for me too, it was definitely like, I'm not really. I could probably count on one hand, how many models I've purchased. It's just not what I wanted to
Right.
do. It's I want to design what I want to
Hmm.
print, and
Yeah.
then print them and make the stuff that I want to. And I
Well,
think that that's kind of what
mhm.
turned me off, at least initially, when I first started looking at them, because it was the amount, every instructional thing that I saw, it was that, at least that was worth anything, seemed to
Mhm.
be people that were improving their printers because they barely worked.
Right. Well, but
But
that's,
that was a few
yeah, and
years
that's
ago.
sort of like,
It certainly
yeah,
has
and
changed
that,
now.
well, but that's also, that's sort of how it evolved, right? And I, for those of you who watch some of my lives, I use this analogy a lot when people ask about like one of my Bamboo Labs printers, right? I'm like, that's sort of like a Mac, and your Creality or whatever, your Prusa is
Yeah.
sort of like a PC. You can modify it, you could do things with it. Where your carbons and things like that, yes, you can make some modifications to them. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but they're more like, I get them, I turn them on out of the box, I remove a few brackets that hold them in place, and I'm able to go, right? And it's a huge difference in the experience. It probably took me, like, to assemble that first Ender, probably took a good solid hour. You open it up and there's a
Yeah.
whole bunch of parts. Like, you're just looking at an extruder head, and all your assembly is your brackets, your beds, and you're going, okay, now I got to figure out, I got to attach my electronics to it. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's
Yeah, well,
nothing.
even a few years ago, before I even got my printer, it was the whole mantra of printers were going to be in every home. Everybody was going to have one, in even in their kitchens, and everybody used them just like we do, computer printers, right?
Right.
And that was a little bit more overzealous than I think people thought. I mean,
Well, but I do think it's like everything, right? I do think eventually, my opinion is eventually they will be in every home, just like any other appliance, right? The thing is, I think it's time. Like we don't realize so many. I mean, when did the guy first invent 3D printing? Like in the
it
80s
was
or
like 1970 or something.
maybe
Like,
70s, 80s, right?
it was early. It's
Right.
older than most people think, right?
Right. And and now you're starting to see them become like a self-sustained unit, right? But I think it's like everything, like IP addresses. People were talking about IP addresses
Yeah.
in the 70s, and now your light bulbs have IP addresses. Everything
Hmm.
has an IP address, right? So I think it's like everything. I think, the people who maybe started, they see the vision, or some of those early adopters, they see the vision, but it's not necessarily that the technology is there, or even people's, I don't want to say interest, but people's, the being able to use it on a mass level, right,
Well,
is
and that's where I was going to go. I mean, for me, coming from the tech industry
Mhm.
and looking at sort of the level of support that you need to do with any, the lowest common denominator is really
Right.
where it comes down to, right? I mean, you used the analogy before of,
Mhm.
uh, of a Mac versus a
Right.
PC.
Mhm.
And yeah, I agree. I think this is no different, until they get the software
Mhm.
to a point where, you know, you can get somebody who is not technical at all,
Mhm.
get a printer up and running with a few tweaks, and being able to get on the phone with somebody if something happens and
Mhm.
being able to walk them through it. That mystique has to run its course,
Right. Yeah.
before I think it will start to really infiltrate, homes in a more massive,
Mhm.
way than it is now.
Right.
Because I mean, you still need even the better ones. I mean, Bamboo Labs, I really like what they're doing,
Mhm.
especially from the software, and not to negate the improvements that they've made on the hardware side, but
Right.
for me, the improvements that I see of them, like basically spanking everybody, is on the software side,
Mhm.
and them being able to improve their existing machines and all of
Yeah.
that. I do think that they're creating enough disruption that other companies are definitely starting to change what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things where you're seeing, like to me, one of the big evolutions here, right, isn't just the ease of the technology. It's also the fact that you could now print in multicolors, right? Because not everyone, like if you're depending on what you're working on, not everyone wants to print something and then paint something and prime something and
Why not?
take care of it, right? Exactly. But not everyone wants to, right?
Yeah, yeah. No,
Some people just want to print it and they want it to be what it's going to be. And and I agree. So some of the part that's really nice about their software is you're able to paint things. You're able to, and they've done a really good job at integrating multicolor printing,
yeah,
into the system. Now, granted, it's still, a limited number of colors. It's not like, like anything else where you print in any color you want type of thing.
right.
But even filaments have really evolved
Oh,
in
yeah, yeah.
terms of coloration. Like it's crazy. Like, like I mean, like I've been using I fell in love, I'm going the wrong way. I fell in love with this sort of color right here, this inky blue.
Yeah, yeah.
I've been using it like a lot. And it's from, Flash Forge. And some of these companies are really creating some really unique colors, which are making it more interesting. Instead of like these like base like red, like that's as red as you could get red,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
I'm saying, right? Like not everyone wants to use these base colors, and I think what you're seeing is with the advent of these new colors coming in, you're going to find things that are more visually appealing when people are creating versus some of the stuff that originally was being created in grays or whatever color, right? And I
Yeah, I mean, once they get it to the point where it's sort of past
Mhm.
the novelty and niche factor,
Right.
right? I think you'll start to see
Hmm.
uh, it go past sort of the hobby level,
Yep.
on that end. I mean, because then you go to the other end of the extreme, and on the industrial and professional space,
Hmm.
I think it's made more headway in those areas
Yeah, I
than
agree.
it did than it has in sort of the hobby, and I'll use
Mhm.
air quotes on that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's so many improvements and strides that they have made, towards fast prototyping, iterative prototyping. Um, I mean, think about it, right? For mass production of a plastic piece, injection molding is still the way to
Number
go,
one.
right?
Right. Yeah.
But if you need to quickly make design changes
Mhm.
and show prototypes, why would you go that route anymore?
Yeah. Well,
It makes no sense.
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Because when if you were injection molding something, it takes a lot more to get that prototype out to injection mold a prototype of
Yeah,
it.
I mean,
And
you have to model that. You then have to CNC the
the
plates
mold.
and
Yep.
then test your part. Where now, just
Yeah. Print
get
it.
a quick
You're done.
prototype together and
Yep.
get it square.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting how we use the necessity of things. So now it's like I'm getting into, as I get further into 3D printing, and dealing with molds and models. I mean, you're seeing more and more uh, molds even being made, out of 3D prints to then go and create models for that. And
Oh,
even you see
100,
people inject using
100.
that instead of actually, metal plates for
Yeah.
injection.
Yeah. And it's interesting too. And I think one of the next sort of, in my opinion, one of the next evolutions you're going to need to see, and you see this, like you point out, the industrial side, but you're going to need to see some materials, right, outside of the current
Yeah.
materials, right?
Hmm.
Because, and even some things to improve, like for instance, like you can't 3D print a plate, right? There's layers in there, and it'll cause bacteria, and you can't all of a
Right.
sudden just 3D print your own, dinnerware, right? And I think when some of those other issues, the materials, sort of some of those layer lines go down where it is sort of closer to that level, you'll also see another level of inception on it. Once you're able to create, like, look, I was watching this video on some guy who 3D printed a jack, right? And he tried to lift a car with it, and obviously it snapped, right? The material wasn't holding up,
Yeah.
strong enough to the jack work perfect. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like the function. So people are able to create those items and 3D print those items, but because of the materials that are available, at this
Right.
point, based on also the printers and what they could print at that consumer level, you can't just go sort of willy nilly print a jack and expect it to lift your car, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just not gonna happen at this point. But I think some of that, once those issues too wind up getting like resolved and set, I think you'll see even bigger inception. I mean,
Yeah.
look, even one of my friends, he was missing a part for an old Fiat, and it just needed to be like a rubber type part, and I was able to actually, find it online, modify it for his year, and basically make a part that worked for him.
Oh
Out of
yeah. I mean, I can't believe how many functional things I printed during COVID
yeah,
because I just supply chain issues,
hmm
and you know, could find them, but nobody had them. So,
right,
I'm like, all right,
hmm
you got to fix these things and,
yeah,
keep maintenance up.
yeah,
So, I mean, it was
yeah,
just quicker to try to figure out how to design my own and print
yeah,
my own,
mhm,
and things are still running, really well. So yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting.
I mean, what's funny is I couldn't find my speed square. Like I lost it and I didn't want to go to the store and buy another one. And I just
So you printed
downloaded a
one?
speed square someone, designed, and I like threw it on the printer. In an hour and a half I had a new speed square I was able to use. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So like it's interesting. And there's so many things that are out there. Like, and we talked about this, like creating for some of the people who just want to print stuff. There's so many things out there. And not even that you got to pay for. There's a lot of things, like if you go to
Yeah, there's a lot of free stuff out
there's
there.
a lot of free stuff out there. Now, always double check it, because how
Yeah,
accurate
yeah,
it is and how
yeah.
good it is and how it prints is always a different thing. But like if I had a speed square, I would make sure, and this is what I did, I made sure it was really the right dimensions and the right angles, right? Before you start cutting wood with it, or you know what I mean, measuring stuff out with it, you want to make sure, because here's the thing. people don't even sometimes translate that, and they'll do silly stuff like, "Oh, it doesn't fit on my printer. Let me scale it down or scale it up." Well, if you scale
Yeah.
it down or scale it up, it's going to be bigger than whatever. If that speed square is 6 inches, it's going to be bigger or it's going to be smaller, depending on how you scale it, right? So,
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think that's sort of, I mean, we're saying the same thing. It's like, there's still this technical element that you have
mhm,
to keep in mind.
yeah,
And at the end of the day, I am still a firm believer that it's still about good design,
yeah,
especially on the
absolutely,
functional side of things, right? You know,
absolutely.
if designers are going to be where it's at, and their skills are going to have
Mhm,
to improve compared to what they were doing, because those lines are going to continue to get blurred as to
yeah,
who's doing what.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask you: so, do you like the fact to print stuff more, or actually or make stuff in the digital side to then go print it? Where do you like to live, so to speak?
So I say I'm about 50-50, right? I say I live in that 50-50 realm. I mean, most of what I'm printing is, most of what I'm printing, right, for videos and stuff like that, that's stuff that, is just fun to print, right?
Right.
It's exposing the industry, it's exposing 3D printing to people who wouldn't necessarily be interested, or
Mhm.
it really wouldn't occur to them, right? So
Okay.
there's part of me that's doing that, where I'm trying to go like, hey, here's all the fun stuff you can do, and here's how easy it is to do, and here's some tips on doing it, right? Then the other part of me, the other 50%, I'm designing stuff, but I'm designing mostly creative stuff and a small piece of functional stuff. So basically what I'm doing is I'm creating, like, it's more of the necessity things. I'm not one of those people that I'm going, oh, I'm going to go create whatever, a pliers or a wrench and throw it up there for everyone to download, right? That's not what I'm doing.
Right.
But like, for instance, the Z stop on one of my resin printers broke, literally broke. And, I mean, and I'll look sometimes to see if someone else designed it, right? Because I'm not going to design something that's so simple that someone else designed. And it broke. So I looked, no one designed it. Basically, I just went, I spent the whatever 10 minutes to design it, and then
Right.
printed the Z stop, and there we go. And now it functions as a Z stop on this resin printer that I snapped off, right? So that's part of what I do. I'd say that's a percent of what I do. And the other part is I've been working on like a whole series of sort of creative, fun sort of sculpture slash flexi pieces that I still have yet to completely finish. But I've done a lot of like,
Cool.
I've done a lot of like I did a frost giant, I did the goblin, I've done a whole bunch of really cool, fun sort of characters. So it's a mixture for me. I'd say it's about 50-50.
Okay.
I think it depends on what I feel like doing. Like, I'm working on a video now and it's requiring me to do certain things that I need to print, right? So,
Right.
like, for instance, when I was talking about glues, I was using this sword you see back here as the example of gluing, which was from Loot Studios, right? But here's the thing. I've also designed some cosplay stuff also.
Right.
So
Right.
it just
Right.
depends on what I'm doing and where it is. So I'd say I'm a good 50-50 split.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely more on. To me, the printer now is just more of a. It's a tool to create the end result. I
Mhm.
almost don't. I'm now at the point where I'm like, I'd rather sculpt and design
Right.
and make sure that I'm becoming more and more knowledgeable about how to sculpt and design
Mhm.
for 3D printing, because there are some things you do have to sort of keep in mind, as
Yeah,
you're
absolutely.
creating these models and things like that. But coming from the tech world, which was my
Mhm.
former life, to now more of the creative side, I still like to keep my toes in that water, so to speak.
Right.
But those that don't know, I
Mhm.
mean, more of my mainstay is fine art. So I come there and then sculpting and traditionally like clay and things like that, and
Mhm.
now more and more on the digital side. And I get the same amount of enjoyment out of that as the
Right.
other. To me, my approach to all of them,
Mhm.
even though two of them are more what I call analog.
Right, right.
They're not digital. I mean, I
Yeah,
paint, with paints
yeah,
and
they're in the real world. Well, I mean, what people don't realize is the real world is analog, right? At
yeah.
the end of the day, the real world
My
is
office here
analog.
behind me is set up exactly that way. There's an
Mhm.
analog side to
Yeah,
things that I do, and then there's a digital side of
yeah,
where I
yeah,
kind of do all that
yeah.
stuff. But I get just as much enjoyment and intrigue, and
Mhm,
keeps my mind like just ferociously active to, oh, I got to learn this, and on the digital side.
mhm,
And while I kind of, through the conversation, I've kind of said I've done a lot of functional things,
mhm.
but it's more because I couldn't believe I was doing more functional things in the beginning.
Right.
Now it's I'd say more, more sculpt type
Mhm,
related stuff, as I learn more and fill it
mhm.
in, with the functional stuff.
Right.
Um, but I'm kind of also on the flip side of you, where it's like, having the different colors and print different colors. I mean, I think there's some functional things that I would do,
Mhm.
but on the sculpting end, I'd rather paint them.
Right. Well,
I mean,
yeah,
and that's just more of kind of just
yeah.
what I like to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because like if you break it down into like okay, if I'm gonna break it down into sort of the resin stuff, right? You can't multicolor resin print. Not that I'm aware of, right? I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know of any.
I'm not aware of it either.
I've seen people try to do silly stuff where they change out the resin and do it at layers, but that's not really.
Why would you want to
Right.
torture
That's
yourself?
a really multicolor printing. Yeah, you're printing in
Yeah,
different resin colors, but it's not really multicolor
yeah,
printing.
yeah.
Like the way you would see like the same color in a certain level. Like I'm just going to grab something over here. Like you see the eyeball of this little guy, where
Right, right.
in the same layer you have multiple colors, right? It's not that type of a multicolor printing.
Well, it's a different
Um,
tool, right?
yeah.
It's a,
So, so so those things I think will continue for the time being to be, hand painted, right? You're going to need some sort of hand painting that goes on. And
yeah,
it's crazy because I paint a ton of minis. And it's funny because I also have bought a ton of minis that are pre painted. And the quality difference from when you paint them, and I'm not even like this expert mini painter. Like, I'm like, okay, I've been doing it forever. But,
right.
like, I'm not like this expert. I'm like this really amazing artist at it. But the quality, even at my level, is so much better than the pre-painted ones. Like it's like ridiculous, right?
Yeah, well,
But
you're putting an effort into
yeah,
it that you're making it what your
but,
vision is,
but I
in
do
a
I do
sense.
believe, right? And I've been experimenting a lot with this. Like, and I'm showing this for those of you who are listening. You may want to watch, but like this item here, like I wanted to use just materials and not paint it. So
Right.
basically, I use different materials.
Oh,
I
cool.
use different sort of like I wanted. I was experimenting with like a darker. Filament here, so the copper looks slightly darker. So there are things, and with something like this, like even if you just put a simple wash on it, it would give it a lot more detail, right? But I've been experimenting, and sort of preaching a little bit about like hey, it's not always about printing it and then doing all this extra prep work. Like if you sort of plan, you get, now don't get me wrong, you're not talking about tons of colors, super realistic looking, but you're talking about you're able to actually come up with some sort of things that will actually function really well in terms of color. I shouldn't say function, but look really well, right out of the printer if you're able to strategically figure out where your colors need to be, and you need to be efficient at it because otherwise you're going to waste a ton of filament.
Yeah.
You're just going to waste a ton of it.
But I
So
mean, that's also a good point too, right?
mhm.
Because you can, I mean, what printer did you print that hammer on?
Actually, it was printed on various Bamboo Labs printers. So it was printed because usually what I'll do is I'll
Now, I mean, for those, I mean, you also have a mini. Did
yeah, I have a mini. There were probably parts that were printed on the mini because there are parts that will fit on the mini, right? Because remember, some of these are different parts. Like this is a
right?
different part
Well, and that's sort of my point that
than
I'm
this.
bringing up. You
Yeah.
don't need, while they're making better, huge printers, which also has their pros and cons too.
Mhm.
You don't need to have a huge printer
No,
to, to create some
no,
some pretty big models.
Yeah, and there's tons of software out there that will actually slice your model, whatever it is, to fit on
Right.
your printer, right? And it depends on scale too, right? It depends on the scale you're looking at printing stuff in. I'm going to keep show and telling because I just have all this stuff in front of me. But like this dragon head, obviously, this is not the scale to a dragon's head, right?
Right.
I mean, it's 100% of what this model is designed for. But if this was a dragon head, it'd be like the size of the room I'm in right now,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, so, I'm not doing, and it's interesting too, because, what I think, and a lot of people who have been doing this for a while, they understand scales, right? Especially if
Right.
you're creating more, especially the D, I want to say, especially the D&D people, they really understand scales because there are multiple scales in the miniature world, or anyone that does miniature.
I was just going to ask, right? There's different
Yeah, there's different
levels.
scales, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the original scale was like 25 millimeter. Then they went to this 32 millimeter. Now there's this 75 millimeter, which is easy to paint because the figures are like that big. Where
Right.
32 are easier to paint than 25, but they even have a different look. Like the original scale was that 25, and the 32 is sort of what's common now, which is easier to paint than the 25, but there's more detail in them. But they're also
Mm.
harder to paint at the same time because there's more detail. So
Yeah.
my point is, but understanding scale in 3D printing actually helps a lot too, because if all of a sudden you're like kids like, hey, can you create a sword for me? Right? I mean, that sword behind me is probably over 3 feet long, right? So,
How many pieces?
I don't even remember. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Not bad.
That's
Okay.
my point. I mean,
Yeah.
you can get started with a very small basic
Yeah.
printer
Yeah. And,
and
and here's the thing.
scale out your models
Yeah.
to be fairly
Right. I
well.
would either, if I wanted to print that at the same scale, I would have to slice that, like on the A1 Mini, I would have sliced it even in more pieces,
Right.
right? For it to fit, because some of those pieces are bigger than the A1 Mini isn't,
Right.
But there are friendly programs out there that would help you slice it and then reconnect it together. And what's really cool about, what I've been doing, and a lot of people do this, not just me, but I've been using like wooden dowels, inside of these bigger cosplay props just to add some support to them. So that way it's not just the glues holding, the PLA together, or whatever you're
Right.
printing in.
Right. Well, so now you're bridging both sides, right?
Right. You got it.
You're
Well, you need
bringing a
some mechanical,
creative and a very functional aspect.
right.
But
You
so
need,
it goes back down to what I was saying
yeah.
before. It still comes down to good design.
Absolutely. You need to create some mechanical connection there, right?
Yeah.
The glue is, it's a connection, but it's not, as solid. I mean, and don't get me wrong, there's some really good glues out there,
Yeah.
and epoxies, but it's still having that other piece in there is much better. And that's actually, it's funny because a lot of people they go just use these sort of 3D printing glues, which are great. Don't misunderstand,
Right.
but when you're using some of the epoxies in there, what happens is it also bonds multiple materials. So if you are
Mm.
using like the wood in there, it helps bond the wood to like the
Yeah.
PLA, let's say. So, but that's a
Yeah.
whole other topic for a whole other
It's
conversation.
interesting because it's like I'm been going more on the figure side, like just
Mhm.
creating my own characters and doing all that stuff. Where now I'm getting into the point of how do I slice them and put them back together,
Right.
and then even experimenting with things like magnets and
Mhm.
things like that to
Yeah. Yeah,
embed magnets in the pieces. And
which is pretty common, right? That's
yeah,
pretty
oh
common
yeah,
in
for sure.
3D printing. Like, a lot of people that do like almost all those helmets you see, out there. Like there's people that are doing whatever Iron Man or whatever. You have now the Fallout, the Fallout helmet.
Right.
There are a lot of those are like, magnet together, right? Because they're able to remove pieces and bring pieces back on. So
Yeah.
but I think we got a little off the topic of how people start in 3D printing. I think we went into some
Well, it's still all related
stuff.
to how we got into it and what intrigues us about
Abs-
the device itself. And yeah, it's cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this episode of Maker Everything. I'm Bryan DeLuca from Maker Build It.
And I'm Todd Saal from the Creative Mind Trip.
And make sure you subscribe to our podcast and to our YouTube channel.